The morning the envelope showed up in my mailbox, I hadn't expected anything out of the ordinary. I had just come back from a peaceful pontoon cruise around the lake, coffee in hand, the dog still shaking off water from an impromptu leap off the deck. The lake shimmered with late summer sunlight, and the soft hum of cicadas provided a familiar background chorus. My house, a rustic cedar-paneled home nestled right near the tree line, had always been my sanctuary. I'd bought the place 5 years ago, seeking peace from the fast-paced world of city contracts and boardroom wars. This lake, unnamed, unofficial, and mostly ignored, was the entire reason I chose this property. It was serene, a slice of wilderness with no motorboats, no marinas, no restrictions. Or so I thought. When I tore open the crisp, white envelope marked with the insignia of the Oak Ridge Lakeside Homeowners Association, I was more confused than concerned. Inside was a formal letter stamped in red, violation notice, unauthorized watercraft operation.
Fine assessed, $5.
First, I laughed, thinking it had to be some mistake. My property, my dock, my boat. The HOA had no jurisdiction over the lake, or so I'd always believed. The letter claimed my pontoon activity violated Article 9, Section B of the HOA regulations. I flipped through my copy of the CC and RS and found that particular article vague and barely relevant. It mentioned unsanctioned watercraft use within community water bodies, but made no mention of the lake's actual ownership. What was most alarming, however, was that they were treating the lake as if they owned it. That got my blood boiling. For the next few days, I tried the diplomatic route. I showed up at the HOA meeting with a copy of the property plat and deed records in hand, documents that showed my lot running all the way up to the shoreline. I calmly pointed out that the HOA boundaries, as filed with the county assessor, didn't actually extend to the lake itself. I showed up at the HOA meeting with a copy of the property plat and deed records in hand, documents that showed my lot running all the way up to the shoreline. I calmly pointed out that the HOA boundaries, as filed with the county assessor, didn't actually extend to the lake itself. The meeting room, with its mismatched folding chairs and smell of stale coffee, erupted into arguments. Most board members, especially Greg Thompson, the HOA president and a retired dentist with an obvious need for control, insisted that the lake was a shared resource under community jurisdiction. It's about safety, Greg said with a smug tone. We've had complaints about boat noise, possible environmental damage, and unsupervised recreation. I asked who complained. They wouldn't say. I asked how they thought they had authority. Greg waved a thick binder in the air. It's in the rules. This isn't about ownership, it's about community standards. I told them they were welcome to try enforcing it, but I wouldn't be paying a dime until they could prove legal authority. That's when the tone changed. Over the next week, I received not one, but 3 more warning letters. HOA board members started patrolling my street in golf carts, snapping photos every time I stepped near the dock. Then came the certified notice. The $5,000 fine was now official and overdue. If unpaid, it would be escalated to collections and potentially result in a lien on my property. That crossed the line. I'm not the kind of man who backs down from a fight, especially not when I'm right. I didn't get where I am by rolling over to bureaucratic bullies. I called my attorney, a quick-witted real estate lawyer named Jenna who owed me a favor from a deal I helped her land years ago. I sent her the HOA's letters, the plat maps, and the CC and RS. Within 48 hours, she confirmed what I suspected. The HOA didn't own the lake, and it wasn't listed in the community's official assets. Interesting, she said over the phone. Looks like the lake is still technically owned by a dissolved development firm, Clearwater Holdings LLC. They were shut down nearly a decade ago. That makes it abandoned property depending on how you slice it. My mind was already racing. If the lake wasn't part of the HOA's legal holdings, and if the previous owner had gone bankrupt and dissolved, then technically, the lake was a stray asset. The kind of thing that gets lost in corporate purgatory until someone comes along with the savvy and the paperwork to claim it. Jenna said she'd look into the procedure for acquiring it. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances. I went about my life, fished off the dock, took a few calm laps around the water in my pontoon, always careful to wave at the HOA board members spying on me from behind their curtains. They thought they had me boxed in. In truth, I was laying the groundwork for something they couldn't imagine. While the HOA sent me increasingly threatening letters, I was researching Clearwater Holdings' last corporate filings, tax delinquencies, and asset dispersal notices. I made some calls to the county clerk's office, the tax assessor, and the state business registry. Turns out, the lake parcel was never transferred when Clearwater Holdings went under. It sat in limbo for years, racking up unpaid property taxes. It was listed under a numerical land parcel designation, not even a name. No one had touched it. No one had claimed it. And the taxes? A measly $638 in arrears. That was it. I drove to the county courthouse with a cashier's check and a folder full of forms. I filed a formal tax lien acquisition, initiated a quiet title action, and began the legal process of taking ownership of the lake. It would take a few months to finalize, but the path was clear. I would own it free and clear. I didn't tell anyone. Let them think their fine scared me into compliance. I even sent a politely worded letter asking the HOA to reconsider the fine and offered to seek a mutually beneficial compromise. They ignored it. I expected nothing less. That month, the HOA held another meeting. This time they announced a new lake committee to manage recreational use and suggested installing security cameras near the docks to monitor boat activity. They even mentioned a future vote on building a community boathouse funded by increased dues. I sat in the back row, silent, listening. It was almost funny. They were planning improvements and policies for a piece of land they didn't even own. It was like watching squatters argue over how to decorate a mansion they'd broken into. The whole thing was surreal and deeply satisfying. By early October, I received word from Jenna. The quiet title was nearly complete. In 30 days, barring any objections, of which there were none, I would be the sole legal owner of the lake. Not just the water, but the land beneath it, the access routes, and the easements surrounding it. I was ecstatic. I went home and popped a bottle of bourbon, sat on my porch, and watched the sunset bleed across the lake's surface. The wind picked up, rustling the cattails, and for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The HOA had poked the wrong bear. They didn't just try to fine me, they tried to control me. They weaponized bureaucracy to push around a man who paid his dues, followed the law, and simply wanted to enjoy the quiet life. I knew then that when the title came through, I wouldn't just own the lake. I would make sure they understood that it was mine, legally, completely, and unquestionably. I'd make sure they felt the weight of that mistake. The gears were already turning. I was planning signs, fencing, and official notices. But most of all, I was planning the next move. Because the moment I had the deed in hand, everything would change. They'd fine me $5,000. But that fine would end up costing them far, far more. And I'd be the one holding the bill. The morning the ownership papers came through was quiet, almost anticlimactic, considering how monumental the moment was for me. The county clerk had called a day prior, informing me that the quiet title had cleared all hurdles. No objections filed, no challenges raised. Just like that, the lake that had once been a nameless body of water caught in a bureaucratic limbo now belonged entirely to me. I remember staring at the title deed, my name typed neatly under legal owner of record, with the parcel number and land coordinates confirming what I already knew deep in my bones. The HOA had no idea what was coming. It was no longer a matter of standing my ground. This was now a calculated advance. I didn't waste time. I called up Jenna, my lawyer, who congratulated me with a chuckle and sent over a templated cease and desist notice. She was already drafting a comprehensive usage rights policy that I could legally enforce. Then I called a local signage company. By the next morning, they delivered 10 red and white aluminum signs that read, "Private property. No trespassing violators will be prosecuted." The bold text was unmissable, and I had them mounted on treated with stakes I hammered in myself every 100 feet along the lake perimeter, starting with the trail near the Oak Ridge walking path that HOA residents loved to use. I remember hammering in the first sign with sweat on my brow and a sense of poetic justice swelling in my chest. When the first dog walker stopped to stare and asked, "What's going on?" I just smiled and said, "Ownership has changed." Word spread faster than wildfire. Within a day, the HOA Facebook page was flooded with complaints, theories, and thinly veiled threats. The board members scrambled to respond, insisting everything was under control and that the signs were surely just a misunderstanding. They were still clinging to the delusion that the lake belonged to them, that somehow, through vague CC and RS and communal entitlement, they retained authority. But that illusion shattered completely when my cease and desist letters began arriving at each doorstep. Every household in Oak Ridge that abutted the lake received a certified letter with my legal letterhead, Jenna's signature, and a clear statement. You are hereby notified that continued use of the private lake without the owner's express written permission constitutes trespassing under state law and will be subject to legal action. I had even included a clause offering residents an option to request written permission at a fee of $500 annually per household if they wish to access the lake for recreational purposes. I wasn't doing it for the money. It was the principle. The same people who smugly fined me for floating on my own pontoon now had to pay to fish or kayak. I thought it poetic. Greg Thompson, the HOA president, was the first to respond. He called me personally, his voice tense with barely contained rage. "You can't just shut people off from the lake like that," he hissed. "It's a community feature." I calmly reminded him that the county records proved otherwise and that the HOA's own governing documents didn't include the lake as part of the association's managed amenities. "You all treated me like a criminal over a boat ride," I said. "Now you can treat me like a landlord." He hung up on me. Then came the emergency HOA meeting. They held it at the community clubhouse, and I showed up, uninvited but legally entitled to attend. As I walked through the door, silence fell across the room. Faces turned. Some in anger, some in disbelief, some in reluctant respect. Greg stood at the front of the room next to a whiteboard covered in scrawled notes. Lake dispute strategy, legal pathways, community response. He tried to keep control of the meeting, urging the board to consider hiring a lawyer to dispute the ownership or possibly pressure the county into declaring the lake a public utility. But they had no case. I had every document, every recording, every signature needed to prove the lake had been rightfully acquired. I stood, requested the floor, and when granted, walked to the front and held up the deed. "You fined me $5,000 for using a lake I partially bordered," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Now I own it, entirely, and unless you'd like to pay me restitution for unauthorized usage for the last 10 years, I suggest you stop threatening legal action and start negotiating access if that's what your residents want." Some people applauded. Most didn't, but the message was received. A few days later, HOA board members began knocking on doors, gauging interest in forming a lake access committee, hoping to organize a collective payment structure to buy usage rights from me. But by then, I had decided to raise the price. The pettiness they showed me wasn't just a matter of money. It was personal. They tried to embarrass me, fine me, and corner me with fake rules. Now it was my turn. I released a second policy statement through Jenna. Effective immediately, lake access passes will be offered at $1,000 annually per household. Limited quantities available. First come, first serve. That set off a firestorm. Suddenly, neighbors were knocking on my door. Not with complaints, but with envelopes and apologies. People I hadn't spoken to in months came by with cash in hand and sheepish grins. "Sorry about all the drama," one guy muttered. "You were right from the start." I issued 20 permits that week, laminated and numbered, each granting access to a specific path and launch point. The rest, they were out of luck. Greg and the board refused to pay the access fee and encouraged others to boycott as well. But the damage was done. The community was split, those who paid and those who fumed. Some started parking on nearby streets just to sneak around the trail fences I'd erected. That's when I installed cameras. Trail cams with night vision and motion detection. Every trespasser caught on tape received a warning, then a formal legal notice. Jenna was busy filing small claims actions for repeated violations. After the 5th court filing, word got out that I wasn't bluffing. Meanwhile, local papers picked up the story. Man fined by HOA buys lake. Flips script. Read one headline. It painted me as a folk hero. David taking on the Goliath of suburban tyranny. Jenna gave an interview on a podcast about property rights and due process. I gave none, preferring to let the HOA dig its own grave with every press release they issued claiming victimhood. The tipping point came when I fenced off the main beach area. It was a flat stretch with a little dock and picnic tables the community used often, wrongly assuming it was theirs. I had the fence professionally installed, metal posts 6 feet high with barbed caps and a gate that locked with a keypad. A big red sign read, "Private lakefront, key holders only." Below that, "Trespassers will be prosecuted under Criminal Code 21.34.7. Greg called the police. They came, listened to both sides, looked up the property records, and left without touching me. "Sorry, sir," one officer said. "He owns the land. Nothing we can do." I offered the cop a soda before he left. By that point, it wasn't just about revenge, it was about principle. Property rights. Fairness. I wasn't being malicious. I was being meticulous. Every action backed by law, every policy outlined in writing, and every confrontation answered with cold, hard facts. I started getting invited to regional property owner meetings. People wanted to know how I pulled it off. I explained the process, warned them about HOA overreach, and even considered starting a consulting side gig. But for now, I was content to sit on my dock, alone, unbothered, and watch the same sun rise and fall over the water I now owned. Sometimes, a pontoon ride is just a boat trip. Other times, it's the spark that changes everything. The HOA had tried to drown me in fines and rules, but I learned to swim in deeper waters, and now I was the one throwing them a line, asking how much they were willing to pay to keep from sinking. And they hadn't even seen the bill I was preparing for them. Yet, by the time spring arrived, the lake was mine in every legal sense. And yet, despite the signs, warnings, permits, and cease and desist letters, the HOA continued to behave as though they held dominion over my property, flaunting their entitlement like it was a birthright. What began as scattered individual trespassers, teenagers sneaking in to fish or walk their dogs, soon escalated into coordinated community events hosted by the HOA itself. I'd spent the winter tightening the legal perimeter, ensuring that every document, every surveillance camera, and every square foot of shoreline was accounted for. I even mapped the boundaries via drone to prove that the HOA's so-called common areas actually fell inches, sometimes yards, inside my lake property line. But none of that mattered to them. In late March, the first real offense arrived in the form of a fishing tournament. 70 people, spread out across the bank, stringing up lines, dragging in coolers, even setting up tents for shade. The HOA had advertised it as their annual family angling day, sent out newsletters, and decorated the event with balloons and banners. And all of it, every folding chair, every canopy, was set up on my land. I watched from my deck in quiet disbelief, a GoPro mounted discreetly to my railing, and my trail cams working overtime to capture angles and faces. I didn't say anything then. I just documented. I walked down to the gate once, nodding to a man who looked at me with a smug grin and said, "Didn't know you were invited." I smiled back and said, "I own the lake. I'm always invited." But I didn't argue. I didn't confront. I wanted them to dig their own legal grave, and that required patience. A week later, another event followed. A birthday party on the South End beach, complete with tiki torches, a bounce house, and a rented pontoon floating proudly with "Happy 50th Larry" painted on the side. That boat hadn't passed through my launch. It had come in through a HOA side ramp they'd covertly rebuilt despite my clear restrictions. More documentation. I took video from my kayak, zoomed in on the champagne bottles, and recorded Greg Thompson giving a toast from the upper deck, all while standing on a dock that was 30 feet into my property line. The final straw came in mid-April, during what the HOA called Lake Appreciation Day. I knew about it from flyers someone slid into my mailbox, almost tauntingly. That morning, I counted 5 paddle boats, 3 barbecues, and over 100 guests roaming the shoreline like it was a public park. They'd brought in food trucks. One even parked partially on my easement. Drones flew overhead filming the event. Children screamed in the shallows, and someone had set up a speaker system blasting pop music so loudly it rattled my windows. But again, I didn't argue. I recorded every car plate, every face, every timestamp. Then I called Jenna, my attorney. "It's time," I said, forwarding her the footage. She replied the next day with a lawsuit draft that was as elegant as it was devastating. A civil claim totaling $1 million in damages for trespassing, willful disregard of private property, property damage, including litter, dock scuffing and erosion from excessive foot traffic, and unauthorized commercial activity conducted on private land. Named the HOA as the defendant, along with every current board member as complicit parties. I had 3 years' worth of fines, damages, and market value usage costs itemized. Each event documented. Each violation logged. Jenna filed the claim in county court on May 3rd, and by May 6th, summonses had been served. The effect was immediate and explosive. The HOA's Facebook group exploded with posts ranging from disbelief to outright panic. Screenshots of the lawsuit circulated with red circles around key phrases. $1,000,000 in damages. Repeated trespassing. Individual board member liability. Greg posted a long defensive message claiming the HOA had acted in the community's interest, and that a misunderstanding over land ownership was being unfairly exploited. But it was too late. My title was ironclad, my evidence overwhelming. Even former HOA supporters began demanding answers. One mother posted a video of her daughter crying, afraid that their family might have to sell their home to cover some guy's lake fines. Jenna advised me to stay quiet publicly, and I did, except to send one final certified letter to every HOA household. It read, "As of May 10th, any individual found using the lake or accessing the shore without explicit written permission will be considered a trespasser and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The days of ignoring private ownership are over." That same day, I began issuing retroactive invoices for damages, each backed by my lawsuit. I sent the HOA a master invoice listing every event with evidence: fishing tournament, $150,000 for unauthorized organized use and shoreline wear, birthday party, $75,000 for property access, dock use, and unpermitted watercraft, lake appreciation day, $500,000, including commercial activity and food truck operations. That wasn't even counting general nuisance damages and safety violations. I had consulted a property appraiser and private land rights expert to validate every cost. At first, the HOA responded with arrogance, claiming the lawsuit would never hold up. But that changed after the first pretrial hearing. The judge, a stern woman with decades of land use law experience, reviewed our documentation and gave a verbal statement that made the board members visibly pale. This case appears to be supported by overwhelming evidence of repeated, flagrant trespass. The court takes these matters very seriously. After that, cracks formed rapidly. The treasurer resigned. Then the secretary. Then a general board member who had once publicly declared that I was just a bitter neighbor with a grudge. More resignations followed until Greg was left essentially alone, trying to steer a sinking ship. I received anonymous letters in my mailbox from residents apologizing. Some offered to pay for access now. Others begged me to withdraw the lawsuit. But the damage had been done. This wasn't about being neighborly anymore. This was about justice, and I intended to see it through. By June, the HOA voted to dissolve its current board, and a new temporary committee was formed, comprised of neutral residents, not former hardliners. They reached out to Jenna and offered to settle. We countered with terms: a $1 million fine, payable via a structured judgment over 10 years, with liens placed on HOA-collected dues if necessary. They balked.
I stood firm.
In court, we presented drone footage synced with timestamps, audio recordings of board meetings discussing events, even budget approvals where HOA funds were used for supplies on my lakefront. The judge approved the introduction of all evidence and scheduled a formal trial. But before the date arrived, the HOA cracked. They called for an emergency vote and agreed to our terms. The structured payment was formalized, with annual disbursements guaranteed by their operating budget. I had them agree to a clause. If even one payment was missed, the full amount would come due immediately. Jenna called it the nuclear clause. I called it poetic symmetry. Residents were furious. Not with me, but with the board that had allowed this disaster to unfold. At the next community meeting, Greg tried to speak, only to be shouted down. One man called him a walking lawsuit magnet. A woman screamed that her kids wouldn't be able to go to college now because their savings were being drained to fund legal debt. I kept my distance, but I knew the tide had turned. For once, I wasn't the pariah. I was the homeowner who stood up and won. The lake was peaceful again, not just in sound but in spirit. No more foot traffic.
No loud barbecues.
Just the sound of birds and water lapping gently at the dock. I now refurbished with a fresh coat of paint and a small wooden sign. Private and peaceful. I kept my permits in place. Some neighbors still paid for lake access and I welcomed them. But I was clear, zero tolerance from here on out. The HOA had tried to bankrupt me for enjoying a peaceful float. Now they owed me $1 million and 10 years of structured compliance. Some called it overkill. I called it balance restored. After all, I didn't break the rules, I just bought the playing field. The summer after the lawsuit felt different. Cleaner somehow. Like the air had been cleared of years of tension and tangled property lines. And in the wake of it all, I found myself no longer a reluctant warrior but an unofficial steward. A kind of local legend who had toppled the HOA Goliath not with brute force, but with land deeds, legal acumen, and a pontoon boat that sparked an entire war. By the time the newly restructured HOA board issued their public apology, delivered through a mailed letter, a website banner, and a public statement read aloud at a community meeting that I did not attend but watched via livestream, the entire neighborhood had already shifted its tone. I wasn't the villain anymore. I was that guy who bought the lake, the guy who stood up to them, the one who made Greg Thompson eat legal crow. Even the folks who had once scowled as I floated past their homes now waved sheepishly, sometimes with a soda can raised in salute, sometimes with just a nod. It wasn't long before residents, curious, cautious, and in some cases contrite, began approaching me directly, no longer with sneers or snide comments, but with neighborly questions. Hey, are you letting people fish again? Or, would it be possible for my grandson to launch his kayak if we cleaned up after? Could have said no. I could have lorded my victory over them like the HOA had once lorded their rulebook over me. But that would have made me no better than they were. I didn't win just to become a tyrant of my own making. I won to make things right. And so, sitting at my kitchen table one morning with a legal pad and a coffee mug that read, "Don't tread on my dock," I drafted what I called the Lake Respect Initiative. A simple, honest system to allow responsible residents access to the lake in exchange for a token fee and a signed agreement promising to follow posted rules. For $50 a year, less than what the HOA used to charge in monthly dues for their community pool. Any neighbor could receive a digital pass, an adhesive tag for their boat or board, and access to a new, controlled gate on the HOA side of the lake. Violations, littering, loud music, unauthorized guests, would result in strikes, and 3 strikes meant permanent revocation. Simple, fair, and most importantly, mine to enforce. The rollout was smoother than I expected. Within 2 weeks, over 80 residents signed up. Parents taught their kids to fish off the dock respectfully, older couples floated in inflatable loungers, and even a few HOA board members applied. Quietly, humbly, as if acknowledging that they had learned their lesson. One woman even baked me a pie. "I was against you," she said as she handed me the dish, blueberry and still warm. "But I was wrong. You protected something we all took for granted." I thanked her, but in truth, I didn't feel vindictive anymore. I felt relieved. The lake was finally what it was always meant to be. Serene, communal, protected from the madness of bureaucracy. And I, whether I wanted it or not, had become its custodian. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Greg Thompson, disgraced and removed from the HOA board, tried stirring drama on local message boards, ranting about land barons and pontoon pirates. claiming I was running a racket. But his posts were met with ridicule or outright silence. The neighborhood had moved on. Greg hadn't. That summer, I began hosting what I called Lake Talks. Informal Saturday morning meetups on my dock where residents could drop by, share coffee, and talk about ideas for shared lake use. One retired teacher suggested a small floating library stocked with waterproof books. A high schooler pitched monthly cleanups with volunteer kayakers. I liked the energy, the sense of rebuilding something better than what had come before. So I used part of the restitution money, yes, the first of many annual $100,000 payments from the HOA judgment, to fund improvements. New benches, solar lights along the legal shoreline, a floating swim platform accessible only to pass holders. I even installed a weather station and shared the data publicly for local anglers. And I never stopped pontooning. Every weekend, like clockwork, I set sail from my private launch in the same boat that had started it all. Only now, I did so with a full cooler, a Bluetooth speaker playing classic rock, and an open invitation to any respectful neighbor to join for a lazy circuit around the lake. I called it pontoon diplomacy. Some weekends it was just me and my dog, Boomer, a rescue mutt with a pirate's attitude. Other times I had 5 or 6 passengers, neighbors who once glared at me now laughing over beers and stories of HOA horrors past. An elderly man named Harold told me he used to be afraid of speaking up at meetings. They made you feel small, he said, watching the sunset from the boat's back bench. But you showed us you can fight back and win. I smiled and clinked his soda can. Sometimes you just need a boat and a boundary. I even wrote a tongue-in-cheek memo titled The Pontoon Constitution and left laminated copies at the dock. It read, "We the peaceful floaters in pursuit of serenity and sunshine hereby declare the right to enjoy this lake in harmony. So long as music is tasteful, trash is packed out, and no one tries to build a trampoline on my property again." It got a few chuckles, and it reminded people this was a shared privilege, not a God-given right. One unexpected ripple came from outside the neighborhood. Local news picked up the story, first a blog, then a regional reporter who ran a segment titled, "David Buys the Goliath's Lake." They interviewed me, standing beside my boat, arms crossed, wearing a shirt that said, "Find me again, I dare you." The piece went viral. Emails poured in from across the country. Other homeowners fighting HOAs, some asking for advice, others just sharing their own horror stories. I replied to as many as I could. Some called me a hero. I didn't feel like one. I was just a guy who loved the water and refused to be bullied off of it. Still, I began documenting the saga, writing down everything from the day I got that first fine for pontooning to the moment I signed the deed for the lake. A publisher contacted me within weeks of the news piece airing, offering a book deal. I called it Lake Law, How I Bought the Water They Tried to Drown Me In. It hit shelves the next spring. People read it. Book clubs featured it. Even a lawyer friend told me it was being referenced in a real estate ethics course. Felt surreal. But not as surreal as standing on my dock one foggy morning, watching a family launch their canoe with careful respect, waving to me like I was some ranger or park manager, and realizing, this is what I built. A new order, a quieter kingdom, a floating rebellion turned peaceful legacy. Greg eventually sold his house. Rumor was he moved to Arizona. No HOA, he claimed. But word was he got into trouble for violating a local noise ordinance. Old habits, I guess. As for me, I upgraded the pontoon, solar panels, a retractable shade, even a small onboard grill. I named her Resilience too. Every weekend, I still drift across the water. Sometimes solo, sometimes with guests, always with a cold drink in hand and Boomer perched like a first mate beside me. And every time I pass the old HOA clubhouse, now shuttered and quiet, I smile. Not out of spite, out of peace, because I won. Not just the lawsuit, not just the lake. I won the right to float freely, without fear or fines, on water I rightfully own. And that, more than anything, makes every sunrise on the lake a little more golden. In the end, I didn't just beat the HOA. I replaced them with something better, something fair, something floating,